Welcome to another deep dive, everybody, where we take like one thinker or idea and like really go deep. Like, you don't have time to read all the books, so we're doing it for you. And today it is a medieval philosopher named William Crathorn. Not maybe a household name, but we're going to see if we can make it one after this deep dive.
Yeah, so we're trying to understand Crathorn's key ideas, and where we're mostly drawing from is his entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So for all you philosophy nerds out there, this is like your guided tour through all the intricacies of his thought.
So William Crathorn, he's hanging out at Oxford in the 1330s. And give us the elevator pitch. Like, why should any modern philosopher or someone today interested in philosophy care about him?
Okay, well, he's in a really interesting time, right? He's part of like the first generation of philosophers at Oxford after William of Ockham. And, Ockham's a huge name. Everyone knows Occam's razor. And so Crathorn, he's like pushing back against some of Occam's main points, but also developing his own ideas, especially like how we think about language and knowledge.
Yeah.
And what's really cool is that he kind of anticipates some of Descartes' arguments about skepticism and his ideas about what is real, like ontology, that was super radical for his time.
Descartes, that's got my attention, for sure.
Right.
Okay, so deep dive mission, everybody. We're going to figure out what's at the heart of Crathorn's philosophy. What makes this 14th century Dominican friar someone whose ideas we should still be thinking about today?
Right.
So, okay, basics. Who is this guy? When was he around? What was his deal?
Well, unfortunately, we don't know a ton about his life, but we think he was probably from this village called Crathorn in North Yorkshire, became a Dominican friar, and was at Oxford University, probably most active between 1330 and 1332, when he was lecturing on Peter Lombard's Sentences, which is like a really important book in medieval universities. And we know this because in his writing, he mentions this solar eclipse, and we know that eclipse happened on July 16, 1330. So it kind of ties his philosophy to a real historical event.
That is a cool detail.
Yeah.
Like, I can just picture him, looking up at the sky. Okay, so we also know he was around the same time as another Dominican scholar named Robert Holcott, who mentions Crathorn in his own works. So clearly they were both lecturing around the same time, talking about the same kind of big ideas. And besides those lectures on the sentences, he also lectured on the Bible. And there's even this manuscript in Vienna that might have some of his quadlibetal questions, like those public debates they used to have on all sorts of philosophical and theological topics. But it seems like most of that stuff overlaps with his main work, those questions on the sentences, right?
That's right.
Okay, so he's at Oxford. He's in the mix with all these other smart people. Now, you mentioned he was pushing back against Occam. So where does he fit in with the other big thinkers of the time?
Well, his commentary on the sentences is like a gold mine for figuring out the intellectual world back then, because he really defines his own position by taking on these big debates, and especially by like going after other people's ideas.
Yeah.
And like we said, William of Ockham was like his main target. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually calls him Crathorn's favorite target.
I love that.
But it wasn't just Occam. He also argued against guys like Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus, Richard Fitzralph, even Robert Holcott, like the guy we just mentioned.
Wow, he was busy.
So he's like really hammering out his ideas in conversation with like all the main currents of thought at the time.
He sounds like a real intellectual brawler.
Yeah, a little bit.
But, okay, even though he's arguing with Occam, did they agree on anything, like any basic philosophical starting points?
Yeah, actually, he's still a nominalist, just like Occam.
Yeah.
So they both believe that the only things that are really real are individual things, not some kind of abstract universal concept or essence.
Gotcha.
And he also had a similar theory of predication, which is basically how we say things about those individual things. So like how we use language to describe the world.
Okay.
But the big thing for Crathorn when he was looking at Occam was that he saw these problems coming out of Occam's ideas, especially when it comes to epistemology, how we know things, philosophy of language, and ontology, what exists.
Okay, so he's poking at Occam's system, trying to find the weak spots.
Right.
Did they ever meet, like, face-to-face? Was there any record of them interacting?
It doesn't seem like it, from what we know, it's more likely that Crathorn was engaging with Occam through his books.
Okay.
What he wrote, or maybe indirectly through Adam Woodham, who was like a student of Occam's.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Woodham mentions this Dominican Socius a lot, which might have been Crathorn or maybe another Oxford Dominican named John Grafton. So they were in the same intellectual circles, but we don't really know if they actually hung out.
Gotcha. So he's like in the shadow of this giant figure, but making his own way. Okay, so let's get into his ideas, starting with epistemology, how he thought we know things. The source mentions Roger Bacon as a big influence here.
Yeah, that's right. Crathorn's whole idea of how we know the world around us is based a lot on Roger Bacon.
Mm-hmm.
Bacon said that our minds can only know the outside world through these species, which are like mental copies or representations of things. So it's like our minds are making these little copies of the world.
Okay, so it's like a mental footprint.
Yeah, something like that. And Bacon had this idea called the multiplication of species, which he used to explain how causes make effects. And he used light as an analogy, like how light comes from a source. The object sends out these species and they interact with our senses and intellect.
Uh-oh.
But here's the key difference. Crathorn agreed with the basics, that we can't just directly access stuff out there in the world. It's all through these mental representations. But he went a step further and said that those species are actually made of the same stuff, both when they're outside the mind and when they're inside our minds.
Wait, so those mental copies are literally made of the same stuff as the real things? What does that mean for what we can know?
Well, for Crathorn, the big thing is that all these species in our minds, they have to be qualities because there's no way that an actual substance or quantity could exist physically inside our soul. So our concepts, those are the species, and the species can only be qualities, which means all our concepts are just these qualities in our minds, and these qualities, they're the same kind of qualities as the ones outside our minds. They just exist subjectively in our minds. Basically located in the brain somewhere.
Okay, so when I'm looking at something red, there's literally like a redness in my brain.
Exactly.
Okay.
He even defines cognition as the idea or verbum of the thing. And that idea is the quality that exists subjectively or subjective existence in the mind or in some part of the brain. And for him, sensing, imagining, thinking, it's all the same basic process. It's just different parts of the soul getting and using the species.
Okay.
And he even maps this onto how people thought the brain worked back then, saying there are 3 lobes, one for imagination, one for thinking and reasoning, and one for memory.
Wow. So he's really tying this to the physical brain, pretty advanced for the 14th century.
Yeah.
Okay, so this seems like it would change how we think about certainty, like what we can really know for sure.
Totally. So if we can only get to things through these mental species, then even what Occam called intuitive cognition, like directly knowing something, that doesn't mean the thing actually exists outside our minds.
Right. Yeah.
And he also said that just understanding the words in a proposition, even if it seems obvious, isn't enough to be certain, because language is just a convention. We might know what the words mean, but not really know the true nature of the things they refer to.
Yeah.
So he redefines evident cognition to just mean clear and obvious cognition, which isn't as strict as Occam's definition.
Yeah, okay.
And here's where things get really interesting. He says that when we think about a white thing, our minds actually become white.
What?
Because he's super strict about the similarity between the species and the thing it represents.
Mm-hmm.
He says mental concepts can only resemble qualities, not the substances themselves. Like if a concept could be a substance, then thinking about a substance would tune our minds into that substance.
Right.
And the same goes for quantity. If we thought about infinity, our minds would become infinite, which obviously is impossible. So basically he's saying we're limited to these natural concepts of qualities, and when we think about them, they become qualities of our soul.
Okay, so the mind turns white when you think about white. That's a pretty wild idea, but this seems like it creates a huge problem. Like, if all we know are these qualities in our minds, how can we be sure that there's a real world out there that matches up with them?
Exactly. That's the skeptical challenge. And Crathorn knew this was a problem with his epistemology. Like, if the qualities we experience are the same kind of qualities as the ones out there, how can we tell them apart? And his solution, which the Stanford Encyclopedia calls radical, is that we just can't be naturally certain about reality as we think about it.
Okay.
There's no way to tell the difference between a quality that's only in our minds and the same quality that's actually out there in the world.
So does he just give up then, like say we can't know anything about the world?
No, he tries to find a way out. And his main solution is this principle that God wouldn't deceive us. He says it's self-evident that God being good wouldn't make our minds and senses in a way that would make us believe false things. So we have to trust that our perceptions are basically accurate because God wouldn't trick us.
Okay, so he's relying on God to guarantee that we're not totally off base. Interesting.
Yeah, and that's actually similar to what Descartes argued later about the Dieu trompeur, the deceiving God.
Yeah.
So it's like a medieval take on a very classic philosophical problem.
Right, okay, so God's making sure we're not hallucinating the whole world, but did he have any other arguments against skepticism?
He did. He also looked at Augustine's famous cogito argument, which is the I think, therefore I am idea.
Right.
And he said that even if you doubt the statement I am, the fact that you're doubting means you exist because something that doesn't exist can't doubt. So according to Crathorn, you can't really doubt that you exist.
Interesting.
So that gives us some certainty about our own minds, even if the outside world is still a bit shaky.
Right. Okay. So we're on solid ground with our own existence, even if we're relying on God to keep the rest of reality from dissolving into a dream.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to language. His theory of knowledge seems like it would have big implications for how he thought about language, especially this debate about mental language.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in the 1320s and 1330s, there was this big debate at Oxford about mental language.
Okay.
The question was, is our thinking happening in some kind of universal language of the mind with these innate concepts, or is it more like regular spoken language, something we learn and agree on?
Right.
And William of Ockham, he was a big supporter of the universal mental language idea.
Mm-hmm.
He said there's this language of the mind made up of concepts we get through natural relationships like cause and effect or similarity. And he thought that all the different spoken languages we have, they come from this shared mental language.
No, okay, so like there's this basic level of thought that gets translated into all the different ways we talk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Crathorn didn't buy it because of his ideas about knowledge.
Yeah.
He said if all we have in our minds are qualities that are like the qualities in the world, then we might have these natural mental signs for qualities. But what about mental words for substances?
Yeah.
Verbs, logical connectors.
Right.
There's no natural copy in the mind that could explain those kinds of words. So he said that mental language, except for those natural signs for qualities, is just as conventional as spoken and written language.
Yeah.
And actually, it comes from them.
So you're saying that the spoken word comes first and then our inner mental language is just like an echo of that?
Right. It's a pretty different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
He saw mental words as these copies of conventional words that have the same meaning. So if you speak English, your mental language will be like a mental version of English. If you speak Latin, it'll be like mental Latin and so on.
Yeah.
So while we might have these natural mental qualia, those raw experiences, they don't make a language on their own. And Crathorn was pretty unique in saying that conventional words actually come before their mental versions. He said meaning is first made through people agreeing on it and using it in a community.
Yeah.
Our mental language is just us taking in those spoken and written systems. So whenever we think or reason, we're doing it in a conventional language where that language is mental reflection.
That's pretty deep. It's like saying that the way we think is shaped by the languages we learn.
Right. It connects language and thought in a really fundamental way.
So it's not just that we think and then put those thoughts into words. Words themselves are shaping the very way we think.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow. So Crathorn's not messing around. He's shaking things up with knowledge language. And now let's talk about ontology, like what he thought about what actually exists and the categories we use to understand it.
Yeah. So all his ideas about knowledge and language, they lead him to make some pretty radical changes to Aristotle's ontology. Like Aristotle, he came up with 10 fundamental categories being like substance quality, quantity relation,
Yeah.
like the most general ways we can describe things that exist.
Right.
But Occam, as we said, had already simplified that system a lot.
Right. He got rid of most of them.
Yeah, he reduced it down to just substance and quality, saying that the other 8 categories were just ways of talking about substances and qualities.
Yeah.
But Crathorn went even further. He basically said the whole Aristotelian system is wrong. We should just get rid of it.
Wow. So he's not just tweaking it, he's throwing the whole thing out.
Right.
Why so drastic?
Well, it comes back to his epistemology, his idea that we mainly know qualities. And even those depend on God not tricking us.
Right.
And because of his view that language is conventional, he didn't think those Aristotelian categories were natural or universal.
Okay.
So what's his beef with Aristotle's categories?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Well, he gets really into Aristotle's categories. And he says that the reasons Aristotle gives for separating these categories don't really hold up.
Okay.
Like, take the category substance. Aristotle said that a substance doesn't have an opposite, but it can have opposite qualities. Like a piece of wood can be cold and then hot.
Right.
But Crathorn's like, well, even the qualities of the wood can change to their opposites if the wood is cold. Its coldness is the opposite of its hotness. So that supposed difference between substance and accidents, it doesn't work.
Okay, I see what he's saying.
Yeah, and here's how he puts it. Not only the substance of the wood can receive the contraries, but also the accidents of the wood. But if the wood is hot, not only is the heat attached to the wood hot, but also all the positive coextensive natures of the wood. So he's saying there's not this clear division.
I see. Yeah, it's tricky.
And he also argued that the same thing can be both a substance and an accident, depending on how it relates to other things, like water could be a substance. But it's also the opposite of fire, which is maybe also a substance. So his conclusion is super radical. He says the same thing could be a substance, a quality, a quantity, a relation, whatever, depending on how you're looking at it.
That's like blowing up the whole system.
Yeah, it makes reality a lot more fluid.
Right.
The Stanford Encyclopedia points out that Crathorn is really good at criticizing Aristotle, but he doesn't always say exactly why he wants to completely ditch Aristotelian ontology.
Right. Okay.
But it seems like it fits with his focus on knowing qualities and also what the encyclopedia calls his frequent tendency to materialism. And this leads us to his ideas about atomism.
Wait, atomism in the 14th century? That's not what I usually think of when I think about medieval philosophy.
Yeah, it might seem surprising, but there was this revival of atomism in the later Middle Ages. And Crathorn, even though he's not as famous for it as guys like Henry of Harclay or Nicholas of Autrecourt, he definitely talks about it in his sentences commentary, especially when he's talking about the divisibility of the continuum. So he said that a continuum, something that seems like you could keep dividing it forever, is actually made up of a limited number of these tiny indivisible atoms. And these atoms weren't just like mathematical points, they were real physical things with their own size and nature. Like he thought there were different types of atoms, like atoms of gold and atoms of lead.
So not the same kind of atoms that Democritus talked about.
No, Crathorn's atoms, they had these special qualities. Now, one problem with atomism, going back to Aristotle, is how do you explain how these indivisible atoms can touch each other without either merging together or leaving gaps between them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So Crathorn's solution was pretty smart. He said the problem only comes up if you think of atoms as these points with no size.
Okay.
He said atoms have a real size and they take up a single place, or situs, which he defined as the spot occupied by the quantified thing. So the atoms can touch because the places they're in are touching.
Okay, so they're in contact because the spaces they occupy are next to each other. That's a neat way to think about it.
Yeah, exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia says he's one of the most radical atomists of the 14th century.
Yeah.
And he shares this anti-Aristotelian view with Nicholas of Autrecourt.
Okay.
And they say his whole philosophical system, his epistemology, philosophy of language, and ontology, it's all a super original form of reductionism. Like,
yeah,
he's trying to explain complicated stuff with these simple, basic
Oh,
elements.
wow. Okay, so let's sum up this deep dive for everyone. We looked at William Crathorn, who came after Occam and really carved out his own path. He developed a theory of knowledge based on mental species, which led to some big skeptical problems, but he used the idea of a non-deceiving God to try and solve them.
Right.
He argued that mental language is actually based on spoken language, flipping the usual way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
He totally rejected the traditional categories of being and came up with this unique atomist view of the physical world.
Yeah, what's cool is that he's dealing with these really fundamental philosophical questions about knowledge, language, reality in ways that are still relevant today. And he even anticipated some later ideas in Western philosophy, like his arguments about skepticism are similar to what Descartes was talking about.
Which brings us to our final thought for you all. So given that Crathorn was skeptical about whether we can directly know reality, and that he thought we have to trust God to guarantee our perceptions are accurate, how does this medieval perspective make us think differently about truth, the senses, and the limits of what we can know?
It's a great question.
And imagine a world where the only way we interact with reality is through these mental copies. It really makes you think, and that's what these deep dives are all about. We hope you'll keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for listening.